Welcome to this brief video where we will be thinking about a technique called the stress bucket to think about how we can work with overwhelming emotions. It very much takes the approach that we can all feel overwhelmed at times. It is a very human response. And we're going to be thinking about how we can notice when our stress levels are starting to overflow, as well as some ideas for what might be helpful. So how then to use this video? So this video is based on a group that we have run at the unit, and if you're watching this on the unit, I suggest that you can do it alongside a member of staff or choose to discuss important aspects with them afterwards. It works best if you're able to make some notes as you go along, mostly because we'll be presenting some general ideas, and one of the key things is for you to take stock of what applies to you, what you're taking away that could feel helpful. Now, while there's nothing too traumatic that we would hope to be presenting today, it is important that you look after yourself while you're watching this. So if you are watching it on your own, just feel free to pause as and when you need to. The same can be said for actually revisiting the material. So some people find watching it a couple of times actually helps different parts of the information sink in, whereas others prefer to actually break it up into smaller chunks or sittings. So the overall length today should be just under 15 minutes. One of the big advantages of running this in a group setting is that we get to hear different perspectives from people. So what that means is that how people perhaps are experiencing the same things but just in different ways. And I think it really opens up our thinking to tap into other possibilities for how to hold stuff or to work on stuff. So what I'm going to try and do in this video is to present some of that flexibility so that you can maybe think about a variety of ways that you could draw on the stress bucket technique to find helpful. Before we jump straight into the stress bucket technique, it's worth just taking a moment to think about what actually it means to you when we use the phrase overwhelming emotion. So there are a number of words here, and certainly it won't cover everything, but just take a moment and feel free to pause and write down some ideas about which words stand out to you the most. You might experience just one main emotion as overwhelming, or you may find lots of emotions can feel a bit too much to handle. So one of the key lessons that we're thinking about in the course of this video is getting better at noticing when we're feeling overwhelmed. People are able to do this to varying degrees. It's often common and normal to not be particularly good at noticing, because actually when things are unpleasant, there's something logical about squashing it down, numbing it, avoiding or distracting ourselves from it. Now that can be helpful in the short term, but it's not necessarily as useful in the long term. These emotions are telling us something important about what's going on for us. So learning to feel safer to pay attention to how we're feeling is a step forwards, even if it might feel uncomfortable at first. So some people might notice their thoughts directly or all their emotions directly. If that's you, great, and note down what are the common things that come up for you. For other people, however, it might be that they notice things first in their body. So that can be a helpful clue that there might be some changes going on for us. So looking here at some of the highlighted words. Or other issues might appear, like having problems sleeping, so insomnia, or feeling more tired or fatigued. However, for other people, it may be the opposite. It may be that when they get overwhelmed, the cue is that they've started to shut down or withdraw, or maybe starting to numb out. There's no right or wrong, but it's useful to identify your own personal signature in noticing when overwhelm is starting to happen. So use a handout or a separate piece of paper and note down what you typically experience when overwhelmed. Feeling free to pause the video to do it. Coming then to the stress bucket itself, and just spending a little bit of a time with an overview of how it works. So we all have a certain capacity for managing stress. This is represented by the bucket. We then have an amount of water in our bucket that represents the amount of stress we're holding at any given point. For all of us, there will be things that increase the amount of water in our bucket, so increase the amount of stress we're holding, and there will be things that decrease the amount of stress that we're holding. We go about day to day managing these two things as best we can, how much stress is coming in and how much stress we're able to let out. And most of the time we might manage it fine, But sometimes we may not feel that we are keeping the balance in check, and the amount of water in our bucket or the stress that we're holding overflows, and that can be described as experiencing a state of overwhelm. Coming then to the stress bucket model itself. The idea here is that we all have a bucket, and that represents our capacity for stress. Some people have a larger capacity for stress, so they're more resilient to stress. It takes more before they reach that point of becoming overwhelmed. Whereas other people may be considered as having a smaller bucket or a smaller capacity for stress. They're more vulnerable to becoming overwhelmed with stress. There are lots of things that influence the size of our bucket, personality, genes, our life's experience, and thinking about what those things are can be helpful. But the focus of this video is thinking in a more practical way about what we can do to help manage the stress in our lives before it becomes overwhelming. So one of the things that we're going to be thinking about today is the amount of stress in our bucket that can increase and decrease. So there might be things that pour in at the top and increase the level of stress in our bucket. There are also things that maybe open up taps to let water out of the bucket, to let stress out, and reduces the overall amount of stress that we're having to hold. What can happen if the amount of stress that's coming into the bucket builds over time and we haven't got enough ways of reducing the stress, is that we get to the point that it overflows. So this brings us right back to the beginning of this video and thinking about actually what overwhelm can feel like. So how then can we use the stress bucket model? Well, there's three main ways. We can think about what contributes towards filling up our stress level. We can then secondly think about what helps to reduce the stress level. And then we can think about what generally might boost our resilience so that the size of our bucket is larger, so that we have greater capacity for managing the stresses in our life. Coming then to the things that pour stress into our buckets. So looking at the image, there might be things that pour in stress quite quickly or quite intensively, but there might be other things that contribute to our level of stress in a kind of a drip feed way. So it might happen more slowly, but nonetheless over time can serve to raise the level of stress that we're holding. So we're going to think now about some examples, and some might apply, some might not. So feel free to use your own notes to think about how this might relate to you. So it could be that job stresses are present, whether you have a job, looking for a job, or something else. It could be that there are money worries, changes to benefits, maybe worried about how we spend money. It could be that we're thinking about stress to do with relationships with family, friends, or romantic relationships. Alternatively, it could be the pain that we might feel at not having such relationships in our lives. There's always the possibility, particularly in the current times, of there being health concerns, whether that's concern for our own health or the health of other people. And a lot of that is around uncertainty. But there's also a lot of stress that comes if we have a health issue that adds stress to our daily lives. So if we're in a regular pain situation, back pain or headache pain, what does that do to contribute to our level of stress on a daily basis? Conflict with others, managing uncertainty or change of some sort, whether there are particular restrictions going on in our lives at the moment, whether that's COVID related or otherwise. It might be that we feel other people have let us down, lack of sleep, having to deal with loss or grief, or so many other things. So take some time now to, just think broadly about what are the things in your day-to-day life, both big things, small things, planned and unplanned, that might add stress to your experience. On the flip side, we also want to spend time thinking about what are the things that reduce the level of stress that we're holding. So that might be nice things that we enjoy, but it also might be about how we face things that could be challenging, but nonetheless are helpful for us moving forwards. So it might be about resolving or tackling particular problems that are contributing stress to our lives. It might be about talking to people, and I certainly think that is not always an easy thing for people to do, but finding people that you can express what's going on for you to can certainly be something that reduces stress in the long term. It might be thinking about how we better look after our physical health, our sleep, paying attention to our diet, as over time those things can increase our resilience. It might be about using stress management techniques, about using physical movement in some way to help reduce the stress that we're experiencing. Taking some time for the things that we enjoy, or maybe doing something proactive to manage our worry or our stress, whether that's a mindfulness-based technique or other things. There are certainly lots of options available. Or it might be about how we stay away from people or places that might be problematic for us or lead to situations that create stress. Sometimes the things that we do as a means of coping or reducing stress, at least in the short term, might actually reinforce our levels of stress. So just a few examples, but by no means exhaustive. Thinking about how we might use alcohol or drugs, things like gambling, eating or overspending, might offer some temporary relief or respite from the stress, but actually can serve to reinforce, almost as if there's a hose on the end of that tap that pours the water that comes back out right back into the top of the bucket. So just being mindful about, are there any downsides to the strategies that we're using to let water out of the bucket? We've had a look so far at the things that might boost letting water out of our buckets. We've also thought about what are the things that we can do that might reduce water going into our buckets. And we might say that both of these are about focusing on things that are within our control. There will always be things, just life happening that impact on us and things that are outside of our control. So this is where thinking about how generally we boost our resilience for managing stress is really helpful. So what's included in that? Well, some of it is thinking about how we can regularly work on building our capacity for tolerating stress. And a lot of the coping mechanisms that let water out of our buckets, often those things do over time help us feel more able to manage stress and increase our capacity for managing stress. So developing helpful coping responses is certainly there. But there's also something about increasing our confidence to just hold on and ride the wave for when our bucket does overflow with water. There will be times that happens. So how can we experience that in a way that we feel as though whatever happens, we will get through it and we will cope? Staying with this idea of when things outside of our control leave our bucket overflowing, how do we learn to respond thoughtfully rather than react? So what we're talking about here is being able to pause and choose how we respond to a situation or choose the way that we cope, rather than feeling as though we've been caught up with something that could potentially lead to a situation that causes us further stress. Now, in doing this, I guess we could continue the water metaphor and think about, well, what are the different ways that overflow of stress or of overwhelm can leave us feeling? And actually that might think about or influence how we choose to respond. So coming up is a few images that might create some inspiration. Feel free to jot down some ideas if there's anything here that feels like it connects with you. So we've taken a few images, I guess water-based images, to stick with the theme, just to generate some ideas around how we experience overwhelm, and so what might be helpful for us in those moments. Now, I'm certainly going to offer up a few things, but please think about this and jot down how your situation most often feels to you. So in this first example, it could be that we feel as though 1 minute we're going along fine, and then all of a sudden we're just flipped off course and unexpectedly things get turned upside down. Thinking about what would be helpful then to actually slow down and tune into making sense of what's going on. This next image, it might be that actually our experience of overwhelm is almost like a dam bursting that just floods us with water. It might feel quite scary, quite difficult, and that can impair our ability to think clearly. So here, maybe it's about, I don't know, finding ways to ground yourself, to feel more centered, to feel better able to calm and apply your thinking to the situation. For some people, when they find themselves in a situation of stress overload or overwhelm, it can be that we feel as though we've done it to ourselves. I've set myself up. It's almost as if I've poured this on myself or brought this situation on myself. So here it might be thinking about how we manage our own inner critic or critical voice, because that can really hamper our ability to think about what will be helpful moving forwards. For some, it might just feel like we're a bit stuck and just not know what to do. If that's how you experience overwhelm, it might be that connecting to other people who can help think with you about what to do next would be useful. And for others, it just might feel a bit overwhelming, like we're just a bit lost, and we may not feel like we're going to be able to get to where we need to go. So here it's how we build our confidence in our capabilities, that we do have the resources that we need to get to where we need to go. A few ideas, and please feel free to generate your own. In short, we invite you to think about how you can tune into what overwhelm feels like for you. Think about what are the things that contribute to increasing the level of stress that you experience. What are the things that help decrease the level of stress that you're experiencing? So what lets water out of the bucket? And what is helpful for you in times of overwhelm? In the meantime, we send you good wishes and hope that you found this useful. Thank you.